Hello and welcome to our third section on our startup decision, where we're going to be exploring three alternative perspectives to the startup decision process. This relates very nicely to our last learning outcome for this topic area, where you will have been introduced by the time this session finishes to three alternative perspectives and to have critically evaluated these. So what three perspectives are we going to look at on business startups? Well, first of all, we're going to be looking at process perspectives, and these tend to inject more temporality into the process, emphasizing individual decisions. Then we're going to move on to look at an economic approach. This emphasizes startup as a labor market choice, comparing the utility of startup and working for somebody else. And finally, we're going to look at social approaches. These tend to emphasize the context and the setting in which the startup is taking place. So let's start by looking at the process approach to the startup decision. Now, process perspectives can be incredibly insightful. Some of the benefits are that they highlight different steps in individuals' decision-making processes as they move towards enterprise establishment. They can also highlight the very different factors which can influence the individual's decisions at very different points in time. Process perspectives are also insightful because they incorporate time into the process and give a feel for the delays and lags involved in the startup decision. And finally, process perspectives can be insightful because they can provide a structure for thinking about the help which individuals might need at different stages of the startup process. So let's take a look at the process model now in a little bit more detail. And more specifically, we're going to start off with a piece of research that focuses on university spin-out startups. Now, a university spin-out enterprise is an enterprise that starts in a university with some knowledge or technology that is translated into an entrepreneurial or enterprise framework. The research that we're going to focus on now is done by Donzoir et al. In 2002. Now, you can read the full paper on Learn if you're really interested, but it's not essential for the course. Their research was based on an inductive exercise which involved conversations with a group of staff 15 universities, recognised as having a record of success in promoting spin-out development. They highlighted various things. First of all, they highlighted the different support needs of academic entrepreneurs at different stages of the process. And they also described the key success factors and most frequent reasons for failure at each of the stages. Okay, so what did Donzoir et al. 2002 find out from their data? Well, they basically built a 4-stage model that describes the startup process. The initial 2 stages are inside the university, and then in stages 3 and 4, the decision-making process moves to more external contexts outside the university. To start off with, though, we have a stage 1 of ideas generation, and here is where research ideas with commercial potential are identified. Then we move to the second stage, which is where ideas are finalised. So typical activities include developing market propositions, proof of concept, prototyping, and sourcing finance. Then, again, as I said, we move to external forces outside of the university. So here, the context is no longer within the university itself. The company is launched in stage 3. Typical activities here is where the company is formed. Resources are collated, venture team and network building occurs. And finally, the 4th stage is strengthen the firm. This is where markets are built and developed. There is innovation, for example, to strengthen the company and to move it on. At each of these stages, you will also see a series of issues. These are kind of problems or challenges that occur at every stage. So in stage 1, for example, back there on the left-hand side of your screen, where we generate our ideas, within universities, there tends to be an academic culture which sometimes isn't very proactively enterprise focused. So let's take a look now at how this process model works in practice. And let's take the example of Noldus Information Technology. Now, this enterprise was derived from a guy called Lucas Noldus and his PhD work on the behaviour of wasps where he was studying in Netherlands. Very strange area, but people do strange things for their PhD studies. Basically, by studying the behaviour of wasps led to him developing some initial software. So while he was studying these wasps, he spent his spare time developing the first version of the Observer software for the behavioural research. So after developing his ideas as a commercially viable proposition, he moved on to finalising his ideas. He developed commercially saleable products after completing his PhD, and the university itself provided facilities for the development of space and incubators, for example. He also had networking opportunities within the incubator, and these provided business advice and support for the intellectual property rights, for example. The university itself was the first customer for the software, and this provided a sense of validation for the product. So when Noldus was ready to launch his company, he moved external to the university for the stage 3 of his startup decision. He used his own funding and a funding from Cento, which is a Dutch government agency with a mission to promote new technology-based firms. He also accessed technical subsidies, government grants that provided support for R&D and product development, and he recycled resources into the new software product development investment. As Noldus moved to strengthen his firm, again, he did this external to the university. Growth was organic through reinvestment, and his network of academic contacts also remained important though. New products were developed, and they now sell a range of software and hardware products to just under 4,500 customers. They now have 10 offices in 6 countries, and they employ around 100 people in a science park in the Netherlands. Okay, so if you're really interested in Noldus, you can always read more at the website www.noldus.com. For now, though, I'd like you to pause on a question. I'd like you to think about the advantages of considering startups from a process perspective. Have a go at listing as many as you can, at least 2. Click on pause, but stay on the slide when you finish. You can click pause now. Okay, so you probably listed a huge variety there, but the main advantage that I can see is that it breaks the decision to start an enterprise into various stages. Now for me, that's more realistic. Surely when we decide to start an enterprise, this is done in stages. So to start off with, we may have generated a commercially viable idea. So at that point, yes, we're starting a business. But maybe a little bit further down the road though, we have problems in accessing finance. So at that point, we may decide not to start a business. Okay, time to move on, I think. So now we've explored the process approach to this startup decision. Let's take a look at our second approach, which is the utility approach. Now, Blanchflower and Oswald here is pretty useful. They were writing in 1998, so it's kind of old, but they're still pretty relevant. They propose a relatively simple model in which an individual would choose to be entrepreneurial, in other words, start an enterprise, if their utility from taking this route is greater than their expected wage in any other occupation. So when we're talking about utility here, we're talking about really, I suppose, benefits. If the individual works for someone else for a wage, their utility is U equals W. If they enter entrepreneurship, as they start an enterprise, they have U equals pi plus I, where pi is the profit from the enterprise and I is the benefit, non-financial benefit, of being one's own boss. The probability, therefore, that someone will start a firm is pi plus I is greater than W. Profit plus benefit is greater than the wage, assuming they face no financial constraints. The interesting thing, of course, is what determines pi, I, and W for any individual. Benefits, for example, can be an incredibly personal thing. Now, Blanchflower and Oswald's paper goes into a lot more detail. It's a very economics-based paper. It is on Learn. The key findings, though, from the model are that lower wage levels create a greater desire, i.e. a need for entrepreneurship. And we can relate this to necessity-based entrepreneurship. Greater opportunities may also increase entrepreneurial activity. And financial constraints involve welfare loss. So how does this model work in practice? Let's take a look at some data from the National Child Development Survey in the UK, which covers all births from March the 3rd to the 9th, 1958, and surveyed regularly thereafter. Specifically, we can see data from the 1981 and 1991 waves and consider the probability of an individual being self-employed. Now, on the right-hand side of your table there, you can see some statistics. If you're especially interested in these, then you can press pause and read at your own leisure. For now, though, let's just take a look at some of the key results, and there are some interesting findings from this data. First of all, the data suggests that the receipt of an inheritance or gift has a positive effect on an individual becoming self-employed, in other words, starting an enterprise. And this effect is larger for younger people. So, people receiving a gift or inheritance are more likely to start an enterprise, especially if they are young. The most commonly cited reason for people not becoming self-employed or starting an enterprise was the lack of capital and money, unsurprisingly. Small businesses generally tend not to be started with bank loans, but with support from family and friends. And fourthly, psychological factors play a much lesser role in determining who becomes an entrepreneur. And finally, the data suggests that people who are self-employed are in general happier than those who are working for someone else. And this might provide some justification for the use of a utility-based approach. Okay, so time to pause for a question, I think. Ask yourselves, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the utility approach? If it helps, you can compare and contrast the advantages and disadvantages of the process approach towards the startup decision that we've looked at previously. When you've paused and reflected on this question, you can move on. Okay, so we've looked at process approaches, we've looked at the utility approach, and now we're going to look at our third approach towards the startup decision, and this is the social approach. And we can start our explorations with a writer called Van der Boom, who was writing in 2005, and she differentiated between push and pull factors. Pull factors, she describes, are those that pull an individual towards entrepreneurship. These are frequently said to include self-fulfillment, self-determination, a sense of accomplishment, control, profit, and family security. Push factors are those which push people out of their current jobs, though. Being a victim of downsizing, having aspirations threatened, or women realising they have hit the corporate glass ceiling, for example. And you can see how she relates these push and pull factors into a model of entrepreneurship. Interestingly, though, we can also talk about drives to become entrepreneurial and where there's no other alternatives. We can relate these to opportunity-based entrepreneurship and necessity-based entrepreneurship. So how does this all work in practice? Well, we can draw on Van der Boom's own research from 2005. There she was organising a review of issues surrounding female European startups. Now, being critical for a minute, we can say that maybe her research isn't very representative. Her research is focusing, remember, on European startups and startups that are headed by women. However, she does highlight some very specific issues. So, for example, there is an existence of labour market segmentation. Secondly, she found that there's a relevance of general business advice and support, and the need for specific support, particularly where women have been out of the labour market for a period of time. She also highlights the impact of domestic responsibilities on the startup decision and access to finance. She notes there are lags in the startup process, and finally, difficulties in the transition from benefits to self-employment. In addition, we can see another model by Legan Fox, who was writing in 2005 and who also contributes towards the social approach to explaining why sometimes entrepreneurs start businesses and why sometimes they don't. She identifies a huge number of different variables which might contribute towards the decision-making process, and you can read about these by pressing pause at your own leisure. For example, she identifies leadership capability, background, current family, and the context of the business all contribute towards that decision-making process. Time for our last question, though. Do you think the social approach is a better way of understanding why people make decisions to start an enterprise compared to the utility approach? Have a think, press pause, and then when you're ready, you can move on to the last section, which is our takeaways for this topic area.